Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you very much.
May we please call Mr. Russell?
Yes.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Could you confirm your full name, please, Mr. Russell?
Yes, Mark Francis Russell.
As you know, my name is Emma Price, and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Thank you for coming to the inquiry today to assist it in its work and for providing a very detailed witness statement in advance of today. You should have a hard copy of that statement in a bundle in front of you at tab 2A. Do you have that?
Yes, I do.
It is dated the 13th of June 2024. If you could turn to page 101 of that statement, please.
Yep.
Do you have a copy with a visible signature?
Yes,
Is that your signature?
it is.
I understand you have some minor corrections that you'd like to make to the statement. Is that right?
Yes, please.
Would you like to tell me what those are?
Yes, so on paragraph 55, where the statement says the annual reviews, and then it gives an example of UKGI disclosure, should read, the annual reviews illustrate this focus and level of detail. And also in paragraph 55, where the statement says that the date of Charles Donald's first witness statement is the 6th of February 2024, it should read the 19th of February 2024.
Are those all the corrections you'd like to make?
They are, yeah.
With those corrections made, are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
For the purposes of the transcript, the reference for Mr. Russell's statement is WITN 008-00100. Mr. Russell, your witness statement is now in evidence and will be published on the inquiry's website in due course. As such, I will not be asking you about every aspect of that statement this morning, just about certain specific issues which are addressed within it. I'd like to start, please, with your qualifications, professional background, and the roles you have held which are of relevance to the matters being explored by the inquiry. You explain in your statement that you hold a degree in economics and management science, as well as an MBA, is that correct?
Correct.
Your career has been predominantly in corporate finance. The last role that you held before joining the shareholder executive in 2004 was at KPMG, is that right?
Correct.
And you were a corporate finance partner in their London and Frankfurt offices.
Correct.
When you joined the shareholder executive in 2004, is it right that you did so in the role of Director of Corporate Finance?
That's right.
And at that time, the shareholder executive sat within the Department of Trade and Industry.
It did.
So your employment contract was with the Department of Trade and Industry.
Correct.
What did your role as Director of Corporate Finance entail?
Well, if I go back to the purpose of the shareholder executive when it was established in 2002, I think, it was, as we stated, it was to professionalise government's management of its shareholdings. Typically, it's commercial and economic shareholdings, and a number of those shareholdings eventually were sold. So shareholdings such as British Energy and Royal Mail. And that governance role then expanded into the governance of government's larger arm's length bodies, not necessarily bodies that would be sold. So there was a definite change of emphasis. In 2005, there was a desire from the centre of government for the shareholder executive to expand its remit into essentially providing a corporate finance capability to Whitehall. And it was on the back of that that I was recruited to essentially establish that unit. The individuals who form that unit already sat in the DTI, so I basically moved them over into the shareholder executive, and that started the corporate finance function of Whitehall. As to what does corporate finance really mean, it's predominantly in a government setting about asset realisations and investments. That's and fundraisings. But I would say predominantly our work has been about asset realisations, and as I said in my witness statement, a sort of developing focus on what we would call distressed situations. So private sector organisations of strategic interest to government that potentially could collapse and where government might choose to intervene. We started to engage on those sorts of situations more to determine was there a way of a private sector solution to avoid government having to intervene, but be prepared for government to intervene. And my sort of first big case of that was MG Rover, and you may remember that situation. The government at the time felt this was a strategic asset, but it wasn't prepared to support it unless there were ultimately some private sector investors that would come in. So the very initial job I did on that was to work out whether there were going to be some private sector investors, as the company unfortunately ran out of cash, and our conclusion was that there weren't going to be any, and so it went into insolvency. That was the first big example of distressed intervention, which became a particular feature of the corporate finance part of the shareholder executive through the late 2000s.
In 2007, you say you were appointed as Deputy Chief Executive of the Shareholder Executive. Was this in addition to your role as Director of Corporate Finance?
Yes, it was.
How did your role change when you took up this additional responsibility?
To be honest, not significantly. Basically, I was there to deputise for the Chief Executive, who was then Stephen Lovegrove. But in terms of the nature of my work, it didn't change very much. My main remit was still the corporate finance part of the shareholder executive.
And it was in this role in 2012 that you became involved in the Royal Mail asset sale process, is that right?
Correct.
Was that the first time you had involvement in Post Office Limited matters?
Well, in Royal Mail matters, yes. Yes, that's correct.
In February 2013, you were appointed Interim Chief Executive Officer of the Shareholder Executive, is that right?
That's right.
And in April 2013, you became the Chief Executive Officer.
Correct.
In 2016, when the Shareholder Executive combined with UK Financial Investments to form UK Government Investments, you became CEO of UKGI, is that right?
Correct.
You stepped down in 2019 to become Vice Chair and subsequently a Senior Advisor for UKGI.
Correct.
Is it right that you are still a Senior Advisor with UKGI?
It is.
but you also hold the role of Chair of the Ministry of Defence's procurement organisation, Defence Equipment and Support.
Yes.
And Chair of Angel Trains, a privately owned train rolling stock company.
Correct.
As well as holding a temporary non-executive position on an arm's length body of the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero.
Yep.
I'd like to turn, please, to government oversight of and responsibility for Post Office Limited. You explain at paragraph 12 of your statement that Post Office Limited is wholly owned by the government, operated as an arm's length body. Can you help, please, with why an arm's length body model might be chosen for a delivery activity of government instead of insourcing or contracting out the delivery activity?
Yeah. So there are the principal reason you might have an arm's length body is if you have an activity, what I call a specialist delivery activity, such as the Post Office, such as HS2, such as Network Rail, a delivery activity that is owned by government, but would with difficulty be managed by government, difficulty managing that by Whitehall. So, and the reason for that is those sort of activities, they involve a particular skill set that probably isn't available within Whitehall. They also ideally have a governance framework around it that again would not be available within the core of Whitehall. So if you have that sort of activity, the question is, is there an alternative to insourcing it? As I say, the trouble with insourcing it is it isn't always clear that you can attract the right sort of human capability, human resource to be able to do that. It's not clear that Whitehall itself can provide adequate oversight to a specialist delivery activity. So the alternative would be potentially to outsource the activity, and indeed that has happened in a number of cases. You privatise the activity, or you in some way contract with a private sector management team to run the organisation. Those are your basic options. But the key to specialist delivery is specialist human resource, and the key feature of that is typically a remuneration regime that again you wouldn't be, which would be incompatible with Whitehall. So that is one very key reason why you would adopt the arm's length body model. The other key reasons I say is one of oversight. If you have a specialist activity, a specialist delivery activity, then you really need specialists to hold the executive to account. And this very much follows the corporate governance that we see in the private sector. Quite difficult for individual shareholders to provide that sort of challenge and oversight. You need specialist non-executive directors to be able to do that. So there are various reasons why government might adopt an arm's length body model, but the two key reasons I would suggest are to ensure that they can get the appropriate type of human resource and capability, and that often goes to the fact that they need financial freedoms to be able to do that. And secondly, adequate oversight on behalf of the shareholder through the corporate governance structure of a board. I mean, a further reason would be arm's length bodies can adopt operating flexibilities that just wouldn't be compatible or available within Whitehall.
You've already referenced the function of holding to account, and you describe at paragraph 13 that it is best practice for arm's length bodies such as Post Office Limited to adopt governance regimes similar to private sector companies. Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 13 of Mr. Russell's statement? That's page 5. In the second half of this paragraph, you explain why the use of boards is important, and you say this reflects the fact that departments and the shareholder executive UK government investments, which act on behalf of departments, are not resourced to be able effectively to scrutinise the work of a specialist executive and to hold them to account. And you discuss that further below. You go on in the next paragraph to say, although arm's length bodies are operated at arm's length from departments, ministers retain responsibility and accountability for the activity of ALBs. So, although the ALB model foresees delegation of certain matters to the ALB board, in this case the Post Office Limited board, the ultimate responsibility and accountability for the ALB activity rests with ministers. Is that
Correct.
right? You refer at paragraph 12 of your statement to ALBs typically being given freedoms to carry out delivery activities free from operational interference from central government. And you explain the rationale behind this at paragraph 25. If we could have that on screen, please. It's page 10. Thank you. And you say it is not simply a consequence of being a public corporation, and we'll come on to what that is in a moment, that neither the Secretary of State nor the Department for Business and Trade, nor the Minister, nor the shareholder executive, UKGI, acting on their behalf, has direct responsibility for Post Office Limited day-to-day operational or contractual matters. This is instead a specific objective. It is a safeguard against central government micromanagement, which is likely to lack the necessary expertise and experience and be vulnerable to potential conflicts of interest. Would you agree, notwithstanding what you say here, that there may be times when the way in which an ALB conducts itself at an operational level can concern ministers at a policy level?
Yeah, I would.
Indeed, you address in a number of places in your statement the fact that there are times when central government will become more involved, to use your words. And looking in paragraph 14 of the statement in particular, please, that's page 5. About 6 lines down, you say this: importantly, although ministers and departments will maintain a distance from operational matters, there will be instances where both will seek to become more involved, especially if issues are concerning enough for direct engagement, but not judged so severe to warrant the removal of executives or the board. In my experience, however, these instances are rare. You give 2 examples in this paragraph of these rare instances, and one is security matters concerning nuclear decommissioning, and the other is ministerial involvement in Post Office Limited concerning Horizon, as ultimately happened. So even with a public non-financial corporation such as Post Office Limited, which you describe at paragraph 22 of your statement as the most independent version of an arm's length body, is it right that in appropriate circumstances, central government will become involved in operational matters?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. That document can come down now. Can you help, please, with why Post Office Limited was designated a public non-financial corporation?
I think there's quite a technical reason for that, to do with, in particular, the amount of revenue that it generates from third parties, i.e. not government revenue. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think the measure is if it's over 50%, then that can trigger a classification of a public corporation.
Do you think that the objective applicable generally to public corporations, which we've looked at paragraph 25 of your statement, that is safeguarding against government micromanagement, was a valid objective for Post Office Limited?
Yes, I do.
Can you explain why?
Well, I think I don't think the Post Office was any different to a number of delivery arms length bodies where the default should be that government Whitehall ministers shouldn't be involved in day-to-day operations. And it goes back to the point about capability. Whitehall ministers, the civil servants wouldn't necessarily have the capability to get involved. And there may be issues of conflicts of interest as well. So I think as a model, it was appropriate.
Given that it is ministers who are ultimately accountable and responsible for ALBs, would you agree that they need to receive adequate information about the operation of the ALB in question?
They need to be satisfied, and the primary source of that satisfaction should be the board. They need to be satisfied that the operations are being managed properly. Yeah. And I should say this is a theme not just for the Post Office but elsewhere. It's almost the length of the arm. And I have to say, my view on this is there are very legitimate reasons why central government should not operationally interfere, why ministers shouldn't operationally interfere in these types of organisations. But there for sure are going to be instances where they definitely need to interfere. So the kind of I've never accepted a position where, regardless of what the constitutional position of an arm's length body is, you can't escape from the fact that ministers are ultimately responsible to Parliament for the conduct of those organisations. So they must be free, in extremis, to intervene if they need to.
Dealing then with the mechanisms in place to ensure that the appropriate information is provided to ministers. And starting, please, with the information sharing and advisory role of the shareholder executive, later UKGI. Is it right that when you became CEO in 2013, the shareholder executive employed approximately 150 people?
Yep.
They were a mixture of individuals from the private sector, typically with a background in finance, and the civil service, employed either full-time or on secondment.
Correct.
At that stage, the shareholder was advising, you say in your statement, on approximately 20 organisations in its shareholder role. And you describe the shareholder executive and later UKGI as a pan-Whitehall resource, with the group working for most of the 15 main departments.
Yep.
You stress at paragraph 33 of your statement the importance of departments regarding shareholder executive and UK government investment staff working on their assets and projects as though they were staff of their own department, with similar rights to information and the ability to advise ministers directly via submissions or in person. With that in mind, is it correct that the shareholder executive officials were civil servants bound by the Civil Service Code?
Indeed.
So was there therefore a requirement that they carry out their role with a commitment to the civil service and its core values?
Yes, absolutely.
And those core values are integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality?
Yep.
Is that right? Would you agree that this includes basing any advice and decisions on rigorous analysis of the evidence?
Yep.
Were and are UK government investments employees bound by the same standards?
They are. I think technically they're public servants, not civil servants, but to all intents and purposes, I think they uphold the same standards.
Can you help with what was and is the system for informing UKGI employees of the standards expected of them?
Well, the Civil Service Code is widely available and almost certainly it will be on our website. At the point of induction, to the extent that people are coming in from the private sector, they would be given that and talk through it. I think occasionally in letters of appointment, the code is even attached. So it features fairly prominently, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's quite an accessible set of criteria. So it should be quite understandable.
What was and is the enforcement mechanism if anyone fell short of the standards?
Disciplinary action, dismissal at the extreme.
You say at paragraph 34 of your statement that at the time you were Chief Executive Officer, each shareholder or corporate finance activity was overseen by a shareholder executive or UKGI director.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
In 2013, you say in your statement there were approximately 30 executive directors or deputy directors and 4 directors, all being at senior civil service level and overseeing the 40 or so shareholder and corporate finance activities.
Correct.
You explain that as CEO, you would get involved in a few of those 40 activities, and you say that was mainly where you had the relevant expertise and experience.
Correct.
And you say your personal involvement was normally driven by instances of technical complexity and complex stakeholder management. Would you be able to give us an example of those features that might lead to your involvement as a CEO?
The privatisation of Royal Mail would be an example. Technically quite difficult, enormous stakeholder management, very high profile. The establishment of, under the coalition government, of the Green Investment Bank and the British Business Bank, those would all be examples where I would get more involved.
As CEO, you say you engaged with other departments frequently. Do you mean other government departments?
Correct.
Typically at permanent secretary level?
Yes, not exclusively, but I would certainly be very familiar with the permanent secretaries and the director generals who report to them.
You describe the shareholder executive and then UK government investments as operating in a relatively delegated manner. And you say this was made possible by high senior civil service to non-senior civil service ratios. Can you help with why that would mean you could operate in a relatively delegated
Well,
manner?
practically, it's probably the only way you can do it, because the activities will often be in a variety of departments. Unless you have adequate delegation, then your ability to add value, to be flexible with the department would be quite limited. Going back to the point you made earlier, what was and is very important is that officials from UKGI, shareholder executive, were treated in the same way as civil servants within a department, because I always felt it was very important that those individuals would have the same access rights to the senior stakeholders within the department, in particular ministers. And that necessarily has to be at a delegated level. So it would just be impractical if you've got 40 activities for everything to come up through the system, and that the ultimate sign-off was me or one of my 4 directors. That's not to say there has to be common sense for issues that are difficult, sensitive. Then of course I'd want escalation.
You deal at paragraph 41 of your statement with the shareholder executive board. Could we have that on screen, please? It's page 17 of the statement. And you describe the board, its composition and its functions in this way. You say the shareholder executive board formally came into existence in 2009. It met 6 times a year and initially comprised 3 executives and 6 non-executives, including the chair. The chair reported jointly to BIS and HMT ministers. The non-executives reported to the chair. 2 of the executives reported to the CEO, and the CEO in turn reported to the BIS permanent secretary. Shareholder executive was not a company, and so its board was not a corporate board, and its directors did not have a fiduciary duty or fiduciary duties under the Companies Act 2006. Its key functions were helpfully set out in a board note, and you give the reference for that. And you summarise those functions as overseeing the work of the shareholder executive, setting strategic direction in light of ministerial objectives, periodically reviewing the delivery of objectives as set out in the business plan, and considering any specific issues referred to it by the executive committee. And you add that the AO, is that the accounting officer, for...
Can I just interject? Could you try to say yes instead of nodding,
Yep.
so I can get it on the transcript? Sorry, Mr. Price.
Sorry.
Not at all. The AO for the shareholder executive was the BIS permanent secretary.
Yes.
As chief executive officer of the shareholder executive, did you sit on the shareholder executive board?
Yes.
Is it right that the shareholder executive board was disbanded and joined with the former board of UK Financial Investments to form the board of UK Government Investments in 2016?
Correct.
And you describe your reporting responsibilities as CEO of UKGI at paragraph 48 of your statement. Could we go to that, please? It's page 20. And you say, as CEO of UKGI, I was a member of the board and reported to the chair of UKGI. I would provide CEO reports to the board of UKGI, which would provide a high-level overview of key work streams. These reports would refer to and be accompanied by the dashboard for each of the shareholder, corporate finance, or other work streams. The dashboards would include summary risk assessments for each work stream. We will come shortly to oversight and risk management of Post Office Limited specifically, but this is probably a convenient point at which to ask you to explain in general terms how you compiled your reports to the UKGI board.
The dashboards, if I start with those, these I think came into existence in 2015, partly driven by my desire to make sure we accurately recorded the activity that we were engaged in. Shareholder executive was set up and remained, and UKGI remained, essentially a Whitehall resource, and one that quite deliberately was a flexible resource. It sought to meet the occasional demands of departments, and I think that has been one of the great features. It is very flexible. As and when issues arise within departments, we can potentially turn our hand to help. But there is a balance. What you also need is some sort of oversight as to what are the activities, what are the core activities that we're undertaking. So these 40 activities, 20 corporate finance, 20 portfolio activities, and that we can socialise that within the group, within the executive committee, within the board, so they have a good sight as to what are the activities that we're actually doing. Secondly, I was very conscious taking over as chief executive that I couldn't possibly be across all of these. So I did want some mechanism to ensure that a senior person did have responsibility and accountability for each activity. So that was another key reason for the dashboard. And I suppose a third one was a mechanism at a very high level to summarise the risk profile, the relationships, the profitability, the balance sheet position of our various assets. And going right back to the start of the shareholder executive, which predated me, they established what they called a sort of traffic light mechanism that just gave, against 7 or 8 different criteria, an idea of what an asset looked like in terms of risk profile, in terms of balance sheet, in terms of profitability, shareholder relationship, etc. Those traffic lights continued, they still continue, and were incorporated into the dashboard. So I wouldn't say it was a very, and you'll have seen copies of it, it's not a massively detailed document. And of course, like any of these high-level documents, they're only as good as how well people are summarising activities, scoring traffic lights, and often those aren't particularly good. But what the dashboard did do was give everybody a good sight as to what it is we're doing and what our activity is. So that was a key document. I suppose the other documents, key documents, would be risk registers, which, as I say in my statement, developed, indeed continue to develop, from the start of the shareholder executive. Typically, risk reporting in the early days was into the department's risk registers, depending on what the asset and activity was. But increasingly, we thought it quite important to take a holistic view and a kind of consistent view of risk across our portfolio, both corporate finance activity and shareholder activity. So risk reporting was a further way of monitoring. And then I suppose the other point to note would be the regular cycle of board papers, which again would give another snapshot at any particular time of what the activity of the shareholder executive was. Not always comprehensive, but these always started, as you'll see in most corporate boards, they all started with a piece from the chief executive, which I always thought was very important, that although it may not be wholly comprehensive, it gives a good picture to board members as to what is on the mind of the chief executive. So I think I'd probably point to those three series of documents.
Focusing on the CEO reports, which provided a high-level overview of key work streams, how often did you report in that way to the UKGI board?
So, sorry,
So the reports you refer to here at paragraph 48, which you say provided a high-level overview of key work streams, was that a regular identifiable report, or are you talking in general terms?
Yes, this would feature in every board report.
So every single board meeting would involve a report by you?
Correct.
As to the high-level overview of key work streams?
Correct.
Did you report in the same way to the shareholder executive board before this, when you were CEO?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Did you report in the same way to the shareholder executive board prior to the UKGI board?
Yes, I think so. I'm pretty sure that the board papers for the shareholder executive followed a similar pattern and had a chief executive summary at the start. Again, common with practically any board.
You say in the penultimate sentence at paragraph 48 that you were ultimately accountable for this internal reporting, but also accountable for external departmental reporting. Again, we will come on to external reporting in relation to Post Office Limited specifically, but in general terms, what was the process by which you discharged your external departmental reporting function?
Well, I think it varied. It depended on what the department, whose activity, either shareholding or corporate finance activity, it very much depending on what their needs were. So there was not necessarily a consistent way of reporting to each of the departments. Whitehall remains a very federated structure. Departments do things in quite different ways. And part of what we had to do is make sure, and continue to have to do, is to make sure that we feed in a way that is useful to a particular department, but it is rarely consistent.
Was there any difference in the way you discharged your external departmental reporting function as between you being CEO of the shareholder executive and later UKGI?
Not really, no. Not in substance.
You explain at paragraph 49 that you also became accounting officer reporting to Her Majesty's Treasury's principal AO, although AO responsibilities only covered UKGI and its operations.
Correct.
And you had no AO responsibility for any other government entity that UKGI involved. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, a very important point, which I hope comes out of my statement, is that shareholdings, arm's length bodies, are owned by secretaries of state. Secretary of State of individual departments. The shareholder executive UKGI never had ownership of any asset, as far as I'm aware. We were essentially advising the shareholder. So if you don't have ownership, then it's unlikely the accounting officer responsibility would follow.
Was the AO role new when you became CEO of UKGI, or did you hold an AO role when you were CEO of the shareholder executive as well?
No, it was new because UKGI was constituted as a fiduciary, as a company, and government requires companies to have accounting officer responsibility. But in essence, and I think I explained, that essentially was about the stewardship of the resources of the shareholder executive, UKGI, and if I've got my numbers correctly, our revenue, which was essentially from the Treasury, but it might be from some departments as well, was of the order of 20 million. And our expenditure would be something like 18 million on wages and about 1 million on accommodation. You know, that is the... So it was not and as accounting officer, I was responsible for making sure that the propriety of those numbers, not complicated, in fact quite simple, but it sort of illustrates the fact that we're actually quite a small and contained organisation.
Turning then please to Post Office Limited specific oversight by the shareholder executive and UK government investments. Could we have on screen please paragraph 23 of Mr. Russell's statement? That's page 9. Scrolling down a little please. At paragraph 23, you say this: under Post Office Limited's updated Articles of Association, dated the 2nd of April 2012, the Secretary of State was the sole shareholder of Post Office Limited and had certain rights, including to receive information from Post Office Limited and to appoint or remove Post Office Limited's directors, including CEO and chair. The Secretary of State is also ultimately accountable and responsible for Post Office Limited. Going over the page, please, towards the bottom, paragraph 26. You deal here with how the Secretary of State is supported in the task of accountability and responsibility for Post Office Limited. And you say, the Secretary of State is supported in this task by other ministers in the department, and the permanent secretary for the department is their principal policy advisor. The Secretary of State, ministers and departments are aided by internal reporting from UKGI, which includes reporting on Post Office Limited. This was also the case at the times relevant to this inquiry, and you deal with that further below. Is this a reference to the internal reporting from UKGI for which you were responsible?
Sorry, you're referring to...
So if we go back, please, to the bottom of the last page, you deal with two ways here that the Secretary of State is supported in the task, and one is the support from the department, the Secretary of State's department, and the other is being aided by internal reporting from UKGI. So my question is whether this is the internal reporting, the external departmental reporting that you said you were accountable for, as CEO.
Yes.
You deal at the next paragraph, in the next paragraph, with the shareholder executive and UKGI representation on the Post Office Limited board. Is it right that it was not until April 2012, when Post Office Limited separated from Royal Mail, that the shareholder executive had a seat on the Post Office Limited board?
Correct.
But since then, the Secretary of State has appointed an official from the shareholder executive, then UKGI, to the board of Post Office Limited as a non-executive director.
Correct.
And since 2014, you cover this at the bottom of paragraph 27, the shareholder executive, UKGI shareholder, non-executive director on the Post Office Limited board, has been the head of the shareholder executive, UKGI shareholder team. Is that
Correct.
right? That document can come down now, thank you. You deal with the rationale behind a shareholder executive, UKGI official, being appointed as a non-executive director on the board of a government asset in general terms at paragraph 15 of your statement. Without putting that up on the screen, is it a fair summary of the position that this was not common practice when the shareholder executive was established, as ministers felt this could interfere with the autonomy of the arm's length body model? But after instances of arm's length bodies not engaging sufficiently with the wishes of ministers and departments, this practice became more common.
Yes.
You describe two benefits to this practice in your statement. Again, is it a fair summary of those benefits that, first, it ensured that ALBs understood and acted in accordance with the objectives and wishes of ministers and their departments? If you can just say yes,
Yes,
to transcribe
yes.
this benefit,
Sorry,
thank
yes.
you. And second, it brought a greater understanding of what was being discussed at board level.
Correct.
Having eyes and ears on the Post Office Limited board should, in theory, have permitted the shareholder executive and the UK government investments actively to seek out and receive adequate relevant information on risk, should it not?
Correct.
Combined with the shareholder executive, UKGI, external departmental reporting process, it made the shareholder executive and UKGI the key source of information relating to Post Office Limited risks, didn't it?
Correct.
Looking please to paragraph 16 of Mr. Russell's statement, that's page 6, please. You say here, the appointment of shareholder NEDs complements but does not replace the primary points of departmental contact. In the case of Post Office Limited, the key contacts were between the Post Office Limited CEO and 1, the Minister, and 2, the Permanent Secretary/Accounting Officer. Such meetings provide senior members of the department with a direct line of sight into the ALB and are a key mechanism for reinforcing departmental objectives for the ALB. Are you saying here that the Minister and the Permanent Secretary, rather than the shareholder executive or UKGI officials, were the primary or key contacts for the Post Office Limited? Or are you simply saying that there were occasions on which the Post Office Limited CEO would meet directly with the Minister and the Permanent Secretary?
Yes, it depends on the circumstances, and it depends on the Minister and Permanent Secretary. Particularly for large organisations like the Post Office, we've always felt having direct contact with the senior people of organisations with the principal accounting officer, so typically the permanent secretary, and with ministers is really important. it complements anything they might be hearing from us. It might actually throw up something that is different. So it depends on the circumstance and it depends on the organisation. If you look at Post Office and in particular Horizon, you will know that increasingly ministers got directly engaged themselves, not Secretary of State, but the ministers responsible for the Post Office. That is absolutely as we'd want the system to work, particularly in circumstances where there were fine judgments to be made. We always take the view ministers should hear directly to the extent that they can.
So was this, in essence, providing a different form of insight into
Yes.
the affairs of the arm's length body?
Yes, yes.
But you're not saying here that these contacts were primary in the sense that they were more important in some way than the UKGI provision of information?
In general, no. On occasion, yes.
In terms of access of the shareholder executive and UKGI to board level information, could we have on screen, please, paragraph 92 of Mr. Russell's statement? That is page 42. And 4 lines down in this paragraph, you say, I do not think that I knew then that Susanna Story had been prohibited from sharing board papers with shareholder executive, and I cannot say how much that prevented the flow of information from Post Office Limited to the shareholder team. Susanna Story was the shareholder executive, non-executive director sitting on the board from April 2012 to March 2014. Is that right?
Correct.
You say you were not aware at the time. Did you subsequently become aware that Susanna Story had been prohibited from sharing board papers with the
Yes.
shareholder executive?
Yes.
How did you become aware?
I can't remember. I think I'd have been told by Susanna or by her successor or by the shareholder team.
Can you help at all with when you became aware of that?
When, and the answer is that I can't remember when I became aware. And again, the context is important here. Royal Mail, of which Post Office was part, was a very independent arm's length body. I mean, if you were to ask me what was the most independent I'd ever seen, it would be the Royal Mail. And what does that mean? It means it resisted Whitehall engagement as much as it could, in part because it felt it could do its work better unhindered by civil servants. There was no member of the shareholder executive on the board of Royal Mail, and I'm absolutely confident they would have resisted it tooth and nail. Now, ultimately, ministers decide, and they could have forced it if they had wanted, but that situation never happened. So that's the context where that we have Post Office spinning out from Royal Mail. An institutional reluctance to have a member of the civil service on the board, and I'm sure as part of that, an institutional reluctance to have board papers shared. Now, some of that reluctance would have been legitimate. For instance, as you're aware, there were 2 or 3 occasions where there were some significant funding negotiations that took place between the Post Office and the government. And for a shareholder executive director sitting on the board, that's a difficult place to be in those sort of situations. There would be, on the face of it, a conflict of interest. So you could see in certain circumstances why they might be reluctant to have a shareholder executive on the board. Sorry, to answer your question, when precisely I became aware, as I said, I don't know. What I did know was the reluctance of Post Office to have anyone on the Post Office board from the shareholder executive. And I think it was a sort of two-step approach. Well, I think the Secretary of State was very clear he wanted somebody from the shareholder executive on the board. I think probably what was agreed was, these would have been legitimate concerns of Paul, I'm sure. It would have been agreed that the board papers wouldn't be shared. I say legitimate because I think they probably did have legitimate concerns about potential conflicts of interest. But eventually that unwound. And I have to say, personally, I didn't have any time for this, and we had other instances of this where board papers weren't shared with the shareholder team. To the extent there was ever a potential conflict of interest, then my view was always you would deal with that at the time, and the director would recluse themselves or whatever.
Did you ever come to understand who in particular had been responsible for the prohibition on the sharing of board papers?
I think saying prohibition is wrong because they can't prohibit, the Secretary of State can demand. Who was nervous about it? I think it was the first chair, Alice Perkins.
Did this cause you any concern at all when you found out?
Not significant concern, in part because it was unwound pretty quickly and the shareholder teams did get the board papers. Indeed, I can't just remember how long it took for those papers to be available to the shareholder team. It may not actually have been very long.
To your knowledge, did the shareholder executive inform ministers or the department about barriers, perceived or real, to sharing board level information?
No, I can't remember that being shared. That doesn't mean to say it wasn't shared, but I can't remember it having been shared.
Can you recall why it was not considered necessary to share that?
Because I don't think it was considered particularly significant. And I think that a danger we overdo this. I think the shareholder teams would probably say they were receiving as much information as they needed to receive absent board papers. I think they probably have said that. Without knowledge of precisely what they were receiving and without knowledge of the board papers themselves, it's difficult for me to judge.
Was there any pushback at all that you can recall? You say that this was ultimately resolved. How was it resolved?
I think there was, yes, I think there was a healthy debate, but ministers were very clear. Well, ministers were certainly very clear about board appointments. They would have been, and answering your last question, I can't just remember if we said to them, and the board papers aren't being shared, but I'm entirely confident that had we said that, they would have said, well, do you want us to tell them?
You say in your statement, the section that I've just read out, that you cannot say how much that prevented flow of information from Post Office Limited to the shareholder team. Did anyone on the shareholder team ever raise a concern about not getting enough information?
Not
Because
that I can remember.
that document can come down now, thank you. You refer in a number of places in your statement to the shareholder executive and UKGI unusually holding both the shareholder role and the policy role for Post Office Limited. And you say that was a situation which persisted until 2018. Can you explain, please, who would usually hold the policy role?
The owning department.
And how would you define the policy role?
Well, providing the primary advice to ministers on the policy objectives for the asset. I suppose that's task number one. And then also typically providing stakeholder liaison, particularly with respect to Parliament. I'd say those are probably the two key tasks of a policy team.
Why is it better practice for the shareholder and policy roles to be held separately?
Why is it? I think probably two reasons why it's important. One is there can be a tension between policy objectives and commercial objectives. And I think one of the documents you've seen written by Anthony Odgers, one of my shareholder executive colleagues, captured this quite well, that it's quite important where there is a potential conflict between a policy objective and a commercial objective, then the issue is exposed. I mean, it's ultimately for ministers to decide what they want to do. But to the extent, for instance, that a policy objective has a commercial cost, it's very important that that cost is exposed to ministers and ministers can make the right decision on the back of it. So the most obvious example with respect to the Post Office is the policy objective to maintain 3,000 post offices that maybe commercially wouldn't be viable. I would suggest it's important the cost of that is understood, up to ministers what they want to do, but and you could argue having separate teams analysing that, advocating that, is probably a healthy dynamic. So I'd say that's actually the main reason.
You refer at paragraph 17 of your statement to part of the reason for the situation persisting until 2018 being departmental resourcing constraints. What were the departmental resourcing constraints and how did they bear upon the decision to keep the dual role as it was?
Well, it won't surprise you, there's resourcing constraints all the time in every department, so this is something we have to deal with all the time. I think it comes down to prioritisation, as decided typically by the Permanent Secretary. Where do they allocate resource? I think this situation probably persisted for longer than we would have wanted, because the Permanent Secretary would have come to the view that actually the shareholder executive was doing this task perfectly adequately and had been doing this task perfectly adequately. If you remember, if you go back in history, when the shareholder executive inherited the Royal Mail activity, they took the whole team, which substantially included the policy people as well. So things like activities such as parliamentary engagement, etc., that all came into the shareholder executive, which was unusual for us because we wouldn't typically do that sort of thing.
And that knowledge and experience, was that Royal Mail level knowledge and experience?
Knowledge and experience of the policy role, it would have developed there. That is correct. But remember, our model is a model of combining private sector people and civil servants, and absolutely key to the model working is that we had a regular flow of civil servants. So at any one time, there would be a cadre of civil servants who may have been acting in other departments who would absolutely understand what a policy role was.
Aside from departmental resourcing constraints, what were the other reasons why the dual role was maintained until 2018, if there are any over and above?
Yeah, I don't think there are. I think I don't think it was seen to be a particular priority. I should say, I did say there was potentially two reasons you would want to split the team, and this has become very clear as a result of Horizon. It does potentially provide another set of eyes on the situation. I mean, I would absolutely acknowledge that. And had we split that team earlier, it might have been the case that that other set of eyes was quicker to the issue than we were.
We'll come in due course to your reflections on that in your statement. You explain in your statement at paragraph 74 that in April 2018, UKGI assessed Post Office Limited as red using the traffic light system for departmental relationship. And you say that was on the basis that you were increasingly anxious for the policy role for Post Office Limited to return to the department. Are the consequences which may have flowed from the failure to separate out these roles sooner that which you've already referred to, the situation where you don't have two eyes from the policy and the shareholder side of things, and the potential conflict? Are those the two main things?
Yes, I mean, would it have made a difference? I just don't know. It might have made a difference. But I certainly couldn't definitively say it would have made a difference. And do remember, even if we had a policy team, that, as indeed we do now, it is a fairly small team. It's a couple of people, so one if that. So we shouldn't inflate the importance of that, I don't think.
Finally, on that point, is it fair to say that in the same way departmental civil servants and ministers do not have the expertise to deal with or oversee the operational affairs of a company like the Post Office, the shareholder executive and UKGI officials were not experts in public policy issues?
Yeah, well, is that fair? We had civil servants who were very experienced in doing policy work. So I don't think you can make that observation.
I'd like to deal next, please, with the individuals with responsibility for Post Office Limited or Royal Mail from 2013. You explain at paragraph 51 of your statement the teams within the shareholder executive and UKGI responsible for Post Office Limited and Royal Mail were distinct. To the best of your understanding, had this always been the case?
Yes.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 52 of Mr. Russell's statement? That's page 21. You explain here that from December 2013, Anthony Odgers became the shareholder executive director with responsibility for Post Office Limited and for the government's remaining RM shareholding. In October 2015, this responsibility passed to Justin Manson, and in January 2018 to Tom Cooper. ED is that executive director, responsibility for Post Office Limited, reporting to Royal Mail directors was Richard Callard, January 2013 to April 2018, and Tom Aldred, May 2018 to February 2020. You go on to explain that on separation from Royal Mail in April 2012, Susanna Story joined the Post Office Limited board. We've covered that already, that she was the first non-executive director from the shareholder executive on the board, and she remained on it until March 2014. From this point, the shareholder executive's shareholder Ned had responsibility for Post Office Limited's shareholder team within UKGI, and these positions were occupied by Richard Callard from April 2014 and Tom Cooper from March 2018. You deal with who line managed Susanna Story at paragraph 54, and you explain that she reported to Stephen Lovegrove up to March 2013, at which point she reported to you on her Post Office Limited position, but continued to be line managed by Stephen Lovegrove on other matters. Is that right?
Yeah.
Given that Susanna Story reported to you from March 2013 on her Post Office Limited position, was she a direct source of information for you when you were compiling reports covering the Post Office Limited for the shareholder executive and later UKGI board?
Yes, but the primary source would be the shareholder team.
Did the fact that you line managed her make any difference to the information flow?
No.
In terms of lines of responsibility, is it right that the relevant executive director was responsible to the shareholder executive director for delivering the shareholder role?
Yeah.
And the director was in turn responsible to you as CEO?
Correct.
Within the shareholder executive, is it right that the executive committee was the committee comprising the senior members of the shareholder executive responsible for day-to-day running of the organisation?
Correct.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 60 of Mr. Russell's statement? That's page 24. Is this paragraph 60, and if we can just scroll up, please, to see the paragraph before. So paragraph 59 deals with the executive committee. Going down, please, to paragraph 60. Is paragraph 60 still addressing the executive committee? Sorry, if you can just give an answer for the transcriber.
Sorry, please ask your question again.
Is paragraph 60 continuing to discuss the executive committee?
It is.
And here you say there was discussion on specific portfolio and transaction matters if there was a significant issue or event, especially if there was a need to socialise the matter. With respect to Royal Mail and Post Office Limited, the Executive Committee would be aware of major strands of activity and any associated problems and issues. It would also regularly review the traffic lights dashboard entries relevant to Post Office Limited. Absent particular issues of concern, the Executive Committee's primary focus would be the resourcing of our governance and whether this was sufficient. How would the Executive Committee be informed about a significant issue or event?
In part through the risk register, in part the directors who ultimately had responsibility for every strand of activity would all be members of EXCO, so partly through the directors themselves raising issues with other EXCO members. I think those would probably be the two major ways. And of course, I would be cited on particular issues and I would socialise them at the EXCO. So there would be multiple ways of information feeding to the EXCO.
It may follow from your answer, but who would decide whether an issue or event warranted report to the Executive Committee?
There would be no clear decision. I mean, your question suggests slightly more rigour than perhaps there would be. The whole point of an Executive Committee is that it should be a forum where you air issues, concerns. There would be a pattern of reporting through the dashboard, through the risk registers, which of course is a formal way of citing EXCO members. But a good executive committee wouldn't just be bound by those. They'd be listening to what colleagues are saying, even if they're somewhat ad hoc. That really is the point of the executive committee.
And just while we are on this paragraph, you've used the term socialising a number of times in your oral evidence and in your statement. Can you just explain for clarity what you mean by that?
You mean sharing the issue? Yeah. And if we come on to risk registers, it's, I think, a very important feature of risk registers.
So I've finished one topic. Perhaps that might be a convenient moment for the first morning break.
Yes, certainly. What time shall we, excuse me, what time shall we resume?
1:15, I think, would be 10 minutes.
Fine. All right.
Thank you, sir. Hello, sir. Can you still see and hear us?
Yes, thank you very much.
I'd like to turn, please, Mr. Russell, to processes for risk identification and management.
Yep.
You explain at paragraph 65 of your statement that the shareholder executive oversaw Post Office Limited through its portfolio review process and its risk management processes. And you describe this as being in addition to overall supervision of the shareholder executive director, portfolio reviews, project monitoring, performance management and risk processes. Starting, please, with the traffic light monitoring mechanism. Is it right that this was established early in the life of the shareholder executive?
Correct.
And can you explain, please, the thinking behind it?
I think nothing more sophisticated than giving a snapshot to other senior colleagues as to the kind of state of a portfolio organisation along certain key metrics.
And traffic light assessments were produced on a quarterly basis by the asset shareholder teams.
Yes.
It appears that the traffic light analysis was included in some of the quarterly reviews the inquiry has seen.
Yes.
By way of example, could we have on screen, please, UKGI 30/41969? This is the April 2012 Post Office Limited quarterly review. And going to page 5, please. We can see the traffic light analysis here. On this particular traffic light analysis, would you agree that there's fairly limited information recorded next to the colours, the green and amber to the right?
Yes, I would, but that's a feature of traffic light analysis. It is very high level. And I should also say it is rarely accurate. It very much depends on a view being taken as to, because a lot of these measures are highly subjective, a view being taken by the shareholder team. And the accuracy of it actually bothered me less because I'd like to get discussion behind these and that people have thought about them. So you will find there's some inconsistencies that go through, and ideally you wouldn't have inconsistencies, but we shouldn't pretend that these are an exact science. They're absolutely not an exact science. I'm far more interested in the conversation they prompt.
There are 6 different criteria or things that are being assessed by the traffic lights there. Are those set and unchanging?
I think so, yes, and I think we still use these. Yeah.
So those are first, shareholder relationship, second, implementation of shareholder model, third, quality of management team and board, fourth, strategy, fifth, financial performance, and sixth, balance sheet and risk. The wider document we have here, the quarterly review, is 5 pages long. Is this a portfolio review of the type you describe at paragraph 67 of your statement, or is it something different?
I'm not absolutely sure. I think the answer is yes. On a quarterly basis, we tended, and I don't know if this is a quarterly review, on a quarterly basis,
If we can go back to page 1, it just might help you.
Yeah. Yes, quarterly review. These tended to be more high level than the annual review.
And you describe the quarterly reviews, the quarterly portfolio reviews, as providing considerably more detail on performance objectives and risk than the traffic light assessment alone.
Yeah.
So going please to page 2 of this document, and just scrolling please to page 3 and page 4. So we can see, just going back to page 2 please, that the quarterly update spans 2 pages there with a number of different topics that are being addressed.
Correct, and you'll see these developed even further. So I think quarterly reviews 2 years on were more detailed than this.
Yes, this is quite an early review in the piece, putting it in the context of separation. Who within the shareholder executive considered the portfolio reviews, the quarterly reviews?
Do you mean who were they presented to?
Yes.
So we would have portfolio review sessions, and one of the purposes, probably the key purpose of those sessions, would be what I would call peer review. So it would be senior, actually not necessarily senior, we certainly would want senior people there, but more junior colleagues would be encouraged to come as well. It would be a way, I go back to the phrase socialise, a way to socialise some of the issues of a particular organisation, and also for the shareholder team to be challenged on issues by their peers.
Would you, as CEO, consider the quarterly portfolio reviews when you were reporting to the board at that high level across all work streams report?
Possibly, but remember we may have 20 of these, so considered is probably right, but we certainly wouldn't include all of these.
Was a matter of practice, did you read all of the
No.
quarterly reviews before reporting to the board? It simply wouldn't have been manageable.
Correct. And this is the point of having delegation directors, executive directors to do that.
That document can come down now, thank you. You refer in your statement at paragraph 67 to there also being an annual review, which was intended to provide a more in-depth view of the asset. And you say that this annual review included commentary on the asset's long-term strategy and objectives for the upcoming year. Again, taking an example of an annual Post Office Limited review, could we have on screen, please, UKGI 30173885? This is a much more detailed document, and the traffic light analysis is also more detailed in this one. The document itself runs to some 60 odd pages. If we can go to page 58, please. Apologies, I should say before we go, this is the annual review for December 2012. Going to page 58, please. The traffic light analysis is a section at section 9. And there we have the shareholder relationship, implementation of shareholder model, those same 6 things being addressed. And we can see by the shareholder relationship, this summary, there is a good and constructive relationship with the new chair and a strong relationship with the CEO, who has demonstrated her clear commitment to Post Office Limited's strategic plan. The new NEDs are challenging management, and this has been further improved by the recent appointment of Tim Franklin, who brings with him financial services and mutual experience. There is no mention that I can find, either in this traffic light analysis or anywhere else in this review, to any challenges to the integrity of the Horizon system. This is December 2012. Second Sight had been instructed to conduct its investigation in July 2012, some 5 months before. Do you find it in any way surprising that there is no reference in this document, in its 60-odd pages, to challenges to Horizon integrity?
No, is the answer. I don't find it surprising because at the time we absolutely didn't understand the significance of the Horizon issue. And this is a theme I'm sure we'll come back to, but it doesn't surprise me at all that it isn't in there.
Are you saying that the shareholder executive was aware that Second Sight had been instructed but didn't understand the significance of that instruction? Or is that something that isn't present in this review because the shareholder executive had not been told? Do you know the answer to that?
I'm pretty sure the shareholder team would have been aware of the appointment of Second Sight, just as they'd be aware as to the reason why Second Sight was appointed. But they wouldn't have considered it of sufficient importance to be putting into the traffic light analysis.
That document can come down now, thank you. As with the quarterly portfolio reviews, who received the annual reviews?
Well, they're available to all members of EXCO. In fact, they're available to anybody in the shareholder executive who wants to read them. But the primary recipient would be the portfolio review whenever that was taking place. So attendees would receive that document.
So would that be the shareholder executive director?
The director would be there, the whole team would be there, but other shareholder executive colleagues would be there. That's, as I say, the purpose of it. And they
so you're referring to the review meeting itself?
Correct. So they would all be recipients of that, yeah.
You describe the addition in 2015 of dashboard reports to the risk documents at paragraph 68 of your statement. Could we have that on screen, please? It's page 27. And at paragraph 68, you say this: in addition, from 2015, dashboard reports were produced to support the UKGI board and ExCo in tracking the performance of shareholder executives, UKGI's main activities, and in challenging teams for individual assets as required. These included a summary of the top priorities for each asset, their traffic light assessment, and the relevant extract from the shareholder executive risk register. The board and ExCo would receive regular dashboard updates as part of their briefing packs. Were these dashboard reports the dashboard reports you referred to earlier as being the documents which would accompany your report to the board with your overview?
Correct. There were a mechanism to pull all of us together.
Taking one shareholder executive dashboard by way of example again, could we have on screen, please, UKGI 30020145? This is a January 2016 shareholder executive dashboard. Going to page 2, please. We can see here a mission statement. Is that general to the work of the shareholder executive?
Yep.
And then on page 3, please, we can see the information provided about Post Office Limited. So in the middle of the page, the asset is identified on the left. Then there is governance top priorities, and there are 6 bullet points there. Then we see the assessment. Is that the traffic light assessment? The third column there.
Sorry?
Is that the traffic light assessment?
It is.
Okay, and we see the lead person. Is that the lead person involved with Post Office Limited?
Correct, Justin Manson. Yep.
Okay, was that the executive director?
No, that was the director.
Okay. So in terms of the top priorities that are recorded here, we have ensure Post Office Limited on track to break even, reconfirm timescales for consultation with ministers and SPADs by end of 2026, conclude the network transformation programme before March 2018, protect 3,000 rural branches as per the government's manifesto commitment, minimise HMG and poll exposure, financial and reputational, to alleged Horizon IT issues. So this dashboard was communicating in one bullet the issue of Horizon IT issues and the challenges or the allegations in relation to that. Minimise HMG and Post Office Limited exposure. Was that the shareholder objective or was that the policy objective?
Well, I don't know that it was, I would say that it was an objective. I mean, as you can see at the top, it says top priorities in terms of governance. So I think that is probably what it is, a priority of governance. And what I'd comment on this, I mean, two things. One is, as you've said, these are summaries, and necessarily they won't be capturing everything. But more important, even at this stage, which I think was early 2016, the horizon risk was not properly understood. And I don't think we can shy away from that. It was not properly understood by the shareholder executive. So for sure, knowing what we know now, this would have been written differently.
Is there a risk that in reducing the governance top priorities to a handful of bullet points in this way, the significance of things and of potential risk is lost?
Completely.
Is that something that you consider was necessary because of the need for an overview? Or is that something, looking at it now, that you think was not right?
It's a trade-off, isn't it? I mean, I still think there's merit in trying to flush out the key issues of a portfolio organisation. Because if we go back to what we're trying to achieve here, we're trying to socialise what the key issues are for colleagues who perhaps aren't particularly involved. So necessarily we must summarise, but we can do that badly.
Is this all the information? And just to confirm, the text beneath, which is marked as irrelevant, does not relate to the post office. Is this all the information which the dashboard being provided to the shareholder executive and later the UKGI board would contain for each asset?
No, they'd also see risk registers.
We'll come on in due course to the overarching shareholder executive risk register. But just in terms of the dashboard that you've referred to as going with your report to the board, this was the kind of level of information being provided.
It was, sorry, and just to answer your question, was this all they were seeing? They were seeing this, they were seeing risk registers, they were seeing board reports as well, which would include my CEO summary and ad hoc reports on particular assets.
That document can come down now, thank you.
Before it does, but can you just explain to me what I should understand by the use of the word exposure in bullet point 5?
Exposure. Well, I didn't write this.
No.
I presume what was meant was that it didn't directly involve the department and ministers on a day-to-day basis. I think that's probably what they're trying to get at there.
Well, I understand that if it stopped at HMG, but it goes on to say, and Post Office Limited. So I'm struggling really to try to sense of what it means.
Sorry, can we put it back up again?
I mean, on a simplistic level, once you've got it back, it could mean to minimize publicity about these things. Is that what it means?
Yeah, yes, I think there must be an element of that. And again, I think this inquiry is showing that there was a concern about publicity around the Horizon system, completely misguided, but on the basis that we had an organisation who had complete faith in this and felt that great publicity around its faults would be damaging. I mean, I don't think we can deny that. That definitely was happening.
All right, thank you very much. It's back now, but I think I've at least had answers to the questions I've asked them, Mr. Russell. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Russell, was there anything you wanted to add now that that is back up on the screen?
No, thank you.
That can come down again now. You have set out some key steps in the evolution of the shareholder executive and later UKGI's risk reporting management at paragraph 69 of your statement. And the first of these was reintroducing a group risk register in January 2013. Can you explain the rationale behind that, please?
Yes, I think I can't just remember, but I think prior to this point, most of the risk reporting went up through the departments whose assets we were engaged on, or whose corporate finance activities we were engaged on. As I think I explained earlier, every department would have their own way of doing things. I think in 2012, 2013, we came to the view that we needed a shareholder executive consistent view across all our portfolio activities, across all our corporate finance activities, so we were better able to judge the relative issues between the portfolio organisations and the corporate finance activity. Otherwise, it's quite difficult.
You go on to explain that the Shareholder Executive Risk and Assurance Committee was established in July 2013, and that was chaired by the Chief Operating Officer of the Shareholder Executive.
Correct.
And is it right that the purpose of the Risk and Assurance Committee was to review key risks across the portfolio and ensure consistency of approach?
Yes. The other thing I was very keen on was that somebody fairly independent, and the person who was chairing that had a deep background in portfolio management in the private sector. I was very keen that she had the ability to just call things out. If she saw something she didn't like or wanted more explanation for, she could just call in a review. So it also provided that kind of ad hoc ability outside the system of regular reporting to be able to just focus on something that one of our colleagues might want more explanation behind.
Who is the lady, the she that you're referring
Fiona
to?
Jane McGregor, yeah.
The Risk and Assurance Committee reported to the Executive Committee on the outcome of the group's discussions, is that right?
Correct.
And you say that the Risk and Assurance Committee would conduct deep dives into projects once or twice a year, bringing the outcomes to the Executive Committee for review.
Correct.
Can you recall being aware of any deep dives into Post Office Limited during the time you were CEO?
I can't recall individual instances. Well, I can recall one, which was a deep dive into the management capability, and I think I was present at that particular committee. I can't recall other individual deep dives, but I'm pretty sure there were some.
As far as you're aware, were challenges to the integrity of Horizon or post office prosecutions or debt recovery actions covered ever by such a deep dive?
Not that I can remember.
In terms of risk registers, is it right that an individual risk register template was created in February 2014 for use in relation to each asset?
Yes, I think this was the introduction of heat maps, is that?
So
Yeah.
we can deal with it
Yeah.
in your statement.
Yeah.
It's paragraph 69. And it's page 29 of the statement, please. Subparagraph E at page 29. So you describe here in February 2014 that the Executive Committee agreed a new risk review process template. And it seems to be saying that was for the purpose of ensuring consistency in approach across all assets, but they were for use for each individual asset. Is that correct?
Correct.
And each individual risk register was aggregated into an overarching shareholder executive risk register.
Yeah.
This overarching risk register, you say, included a summary heat map,
Yeah.
and that showed the risk across the portfolio on one page.
Correct.
Again, by way of example, could we have on screen, please, UKGI 16850. Is this front page here a heat map for all shareholder executive assets?
Yeah, yes, it looks like it is.
You'll see GRO appearing in all the bubbles apart from Post Office Limited. So if you look towards the top of the page, in the top squares there in the middle, you'll see Post Office Limited. And then the others are all redacted in terms of the names of the other assets.
Yeah.
But is this the one-page heat map showing all assets across the portfolio?
Yeah. And maybe just a minute on why we had this system. And I seem to remember this idea of heat maps. We did get a couple of people from private sector organisations to give us some advice on what is the best way of capturing risk registers. The trouble with risk registers for organisations are very important because they alert people to where we should be focusing attention. And going back to my word, they get individuals to think hard about the risks in their portfolio. They are a mechanism to socialise the risks so we all know about them. And they're a mechanism to demonstrate how you're mitigating against those risks. So risk registers in all organisations are really important. But the trouble with risk registers is they become process, and people just see them as, and I have lots of experience of seeing this in private sector organisations. So you need a way to get individuals constantly engaged with and seeing that this isn't just process, this is something active. And I remember when we introduced this, looking down our floor, because we were all on one space, and seeing many of the screens with this on. And I thought, well, we're doing our job here because people are engaging with this process. So this was not the aim of this was something that was very active. It wasn't a passive bit of process. And most important, we wanted teams to engage with it. And of course, most important, it was only as good as what was being produced by the teams. So I would maintain this was a good system, but it didn't capture one of our biggest risks, as we'll come on to.
So this front page has the heat map on, and then the individual risk registers are incorporated, aren't they, into this overarching document?
Yeah.
So we can see the tabs at the bottom, and one of those tabs is Post Office. So if
Yeah.
we can click on that, please. And we can see here that there is another heat map. And this time, what does the heat map include? Can you help with that?
I think this is the risk register, well, it is the risk register of the Post Office itself. Our version of it is not put together by the Post Office. And it's designed to capture what the team believed were the key risks within the post office.
And putting each of those things in a location on the heat map, again, to show what is more risky as an area than another.
Yes, and as I'm sure you know, essentially it's a matrix of where people try to score what is the probability of one of these risks occurring against the impact should it occur.
And looking down below the heat map, we can see a list of items and topics being addressed. And looking please at item 11. We can see reference here to Project Sparrow, can't we? And it's a little difficult to read all of the wording, but if we click on column D, I think that does show the full text. In this column, it's recorded the working group is unable to progress cases and the process is publicly criticised by applicants and the JFSA. If it helps to scroll up, what was that column addressing?
I think that was the definition of the risk, or the characterisation of the risk.
And so if we can just scroll up so we can see the headings, please. So we have risk overview, then impact of risk, the type of risk, and as you've described there, both probability and impact being identified in the box, a mitigation overview, mitigation ratings, further mitigating actions, and current status. So scrolling back down, please, to item 11. You can see in column E, there's identification of reputational and brand risk due to perception that Post Office Limited has not supported sub-postmasters with accusation from JFSA that the process was flawed and not sufficiently transparent. And we can see probability is assessed as 1 there. That's 1 out of
5, I think.
And impact is assessed as 4. So does that essentially mean the probability is low, but the impact would be high?
Correct.
And then we can see in the next box, shareholder executive is ensuring Post Office Limited engages with members of the working group and seeks to address issues over the operation of the working group if they arise. And then going please to column P, we have provide robust responses to queries about the working group, stating the findings of the initial review, that there are no systemic issues and that there is an independent chair. Caution needs to be exercised to ensure that the independence of the chair is not undermined. And then the final column there. Terms of reference have been agreed by the working group, which is independently chaired, but Second Sight are unable to process cases, and JFSA wish to exit the group. An interim report published in July 2013 found there was no systemic issues with the horizon. And I don't know whether it's missing a word there, but it seems to end on horizon, if we can see in the long readout of the box.
Yep.
Was this the Post Office Limited risk register which you deal with at paragraph 124 of your statement, which you say was considered at the Shareholder Executive Risk and Assurance Committee on the 19th of February 2014? While we're on this risk register, can we have on screen, please, UKGI 42124. These are said to be the minutes of the meeting on the 19th of February 2014. It appears to have been specifically convened to consider the shareholder executive's major risks in relation to Post Office Limited. Is that right?
That's right.
And we can see you were at the meeting along with Fiona Jane McGregor, the chair, Guy Mason and Tim Martin. and the presenting team was Richard Callard, Katrina Lidbetter, and Tim McInnes.
Correct.
Much of the meeting, if we scroll down, appears to be dedicated to discussions about the performance of the CEO of Post Office Limited. But going please to the bottom of page 2, paragraph 14, we have this. The committee asked what Project Sparrow was, Risk 11. TMC explained that this is with regard to a financial system that is used by sub-postmasters, some of whom have received criminal convictions for misuse. However, the sub-postmasters are suggesting that the actual system was at fault. All the Post Office Limited investigations so far have shown that the system is working correctly. However, the risk is that if the system were to show up as defective, then potentially the criminal convictions could be overturned and compensation from Post Office Limited sought. So this was in February 2014. Did you or anyone else at this meeting suggest at this stage that Project Sparrow and the issues raised there in response to the query should be raised specifically with the shareholder executive board?
I don't believe we did.
Can you help with why?
Well, I think because we didn't consider, and weren't we wrong, we didn't consider this to be a significant risk. I think it's as simple as that.
That document can come down now, thank you.
Sorry, I say significant risk, a significant risk that the system was at fault.
And what part did the assurances given at that meeting play in you not considering it a risk that the system was at fault?
I can't remember, but I'm sure the shareholder team were there, so they would have given us some assurances on that.
In general terms, you address what risk register information went to the shareholder executive board at paragraph 69F of your statement. Could we have that on screen, please? It's page 29. That's 69F. So from what you say here, is it right that the whole overarching shareholder executive risk register was not provided to the board? So we see here by May 2014, risk registers were included as a standing item on the shareholder executive board agenda. Risk updates included the overall shareholder executive heat map and a summary of each asset's overall risk rating and reputational risk rating. The top risks for each project continued to be included in the core pack as part of project updates and discussed during deep dives conducted by the board. So is this in essence saying that the whole risk register did not go to the board, i.e. not each individual risk register, but higher level information instead did?
Correct. And it illustrates, amongst other things, the danger of, like the bullet points of summarisation. But then the counter to that is you do want board members to engage on it. And if you provide them with 60 sheets, the chances are they won't.
The top risks you refer to, are those the ones contained in the dashboards?
Sorry, are they the ones?
Contained in the dashboards. Are they the bullet points we saw in the dashboard?
Yes, that's what I was referring to, yes.
The deep dives you refer to, are those separate deep dives conducted by the board, or are those the same deep dives done by the Risk and Assurance Committee?
No, I think conducted by the board. That's certainly what I've got there.
Do you recall the board conducting a deep dive into matters at Post Office Limited?
Not at that time. No, possibly later, but not at that time.
You deal in your statement at paragraphs 69G and H with further changes to the approach to risk management in 2016, and then again in 2018 at paragraph 69I. The change in approach in 2018 led to the board focusing their risk discussions on those assets with risks in the top right-hand corner of the heat map, and with any significant changes in reputational or delivery risk. That's how you describe it. Is that right?
Correct.
Was there a risk, which we've touched on already, inherent in this approach of focusing on the top right-hand corner of the heat map, in that it relied too much on the ability of the heat map to flag up where the focus should lie?
For sure.
In terms of your external reporting to the department, you deal with this at paragraph 71 of your statement. Could we go to that, please? It's page 32. And without taking you through it all, can you explain, please, the reporting process, and in particular, what information from the various reviews and risk registers went through to the department?
Yes, the department did have its own risk register, which we would definitely have fed into to the extent it was a business department related risk. There was then, for the business department, there was delivery reports, which were pretty high level reports that focused in particular against, again, very high level, the key delivery goals of the department and so of each asset. But for something like Post Office, it would be very high level.
Lastly, before we turn to oversight of specific issues for Post Office Limited, I'd like to deal, please, with the applicable governance principles. And you deal with this at paragraph 72 in your statement, if you need to refer to it. Am I correct in summarising the position in this way? Although Post Office Limited was not formally required to report on its compliance with the UK Corporate Governance Code, it was treated as a benchmark for reporting on corporate governance by the Post Office Limited Board.
Correct.
More generally, as set out in the 2007 Shareholder Executive Handbook, is it right that governance of government-owned business should, wherever possible, reflect commercial best practice?
Yes.
The Corporate Governance Code for central government departments, you say, would have been applicable?
Yep.
And is it also right that you did not believe there were any material differences between governance in a publicly listed company and a publicly owned company, other than the latter is accountable to the minister, who is accountable to Parliament?
Correct.
That can come down now, thank you. Turning then, please, to oversight of specific issues for Post Office Limited, and starting with oversight of Post Office Limited pre-separation. You explain in your statement that your direct role in oversight of Post Office Limited before its separation from Royal Mail was very limited, although you were at various meetings where matters relating to Royal Mail and Post Office Limited were discussed, including shareholder executive board meetings.
Yep.
And you recall the most prominent issues concerning Royal Mail and Post Office Limited in 2010 relating to the privatisation of Royal Mail. Is that right?
Correct.
You refer at paragraph 77 of your statement to a shareholder executive board briefing on Royal Mail, which was sent to you in June 2010. And it had a relatively short section on Post Office Limited. If we could have that on screen, please. The reference is UKGI 30/41941. Forgive me, I think I may have the wrong reference there. If we could have UKGI 30/41943, please. So we can see there Royal Mail Shareholder Executive Board briefing. And this paper sets out the history of the 2008 Hooper Review, which recommended introducing a private sector strategic partner to inject private capital into Royal Mail, whilst keeping Post Office Limited in public ownership. And if we go to page 3, please, about halfway down the page, the penultimate bullet point there in section 7. Although the post office will remain in public ownership, we need a strong, credible story underpinned by funding on the government's commitment to the network. Public concern about the impact on local post offices has derailed previous efforts to sell Royal Mail. So the focus here was on what was necessary to ensure that public concern about the impact upon local post offices was allayed, given that this had derailed previous efforts to sell Royal Mail. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Shareholder executive resourcing is dealt with in the next section down. And as you say in your statement, the shareholder executive Post Office Limited team was made up of 1 senior civil service grade, 1 grade 6, 1 grade 7, 1 fast streamer, and 1 higher executive officer, with ongoing recruitment for a further G7 and higher executive officer. The view expressed in the paper was that the Royal Mail bill team and the Post Office Limited team were probably adequately resourced. Was this a view with which the shareholder executive board agreed?
I can't remember. I no reason to think they wouldn't have agreed with that.
Is it right that you were not directly involved in the work being done to enable Post Office Limited's separation from Royal Mail, although you received updates through the shareholder executive board?
Correct. My involvement with Royal Mail only, apart from the sale of the pension assets, my involvement in Royal Mail only really commenced when I became chief executive, and in that capacity I was very involved in the privatisation.
You deal with pre-separation plans for Post Office Limited governance from paragraphs 83 to 87 of your statement, and that document can come down now, thank you. You described the intention as proposed by Anthony Odgers for the shareholder executive to take a more significant direct role in the government governance of Post Office Limited, including by selecting a new chair of the Post Office Limited board and taking a seat on the board. Is that right?
That's right.
By November 2011, at the point of the shareholder executive Post Office Limited annual review, the strategy was said to be to strengthen the Post Office Limited's board, including a new chair and non-executive directors to give increased levels of oversight and challenge. And you also say that you do not think you had any direct involvement in the NED appointments. But you say you were not surprised that the shareholder executive had highlighted this as a priority, that is, the appointment of non-executive directors.
Yes.
Why were you not surprised?
I think at the time there was, it was clear that the Post Office was going to be independent, it was going to remain owned by government. It was inheriting a management team, so I don't think any of the senior people, as it became independent, had been recruited into the Post Office post-separation. So I think there was a strong desire to ensure that the board, which would be a new board, was a strong, independent, new set of eyes on the organisation.
Was there any particular concern which NED appointments were intended to address?
Not that I'm aware of, no, other than the kind of strategic challenges of the organisation were pretty enormous. And the two things in particular was driving or increasing the revenue, increasing the transformation programme, making it a more commercial organisation. I think commercial skills was certainly something we were very conscious of.
You have noted at paragraph 78 of your statement, in the context of the Royal Mail and Post Office Limited shareholder executive teams in place in 2010, that the shareholder executive had no role in overseeing the conduct of prosecutions by Post Office Limited or Royal Mail. Why was that?
Because it was, I think we would absolutely have taken the view it was an operational matter for the Post Office and Royal Mail.
If there were operational problems which impacted risk, shouldn't those operational problems be on the shareholder executive's radar?
Yes, if they were considered significant.
But how would the shareholder executive come to know there were problems if there was no oversight of those operational matters?
Well, I think while Post Office was part of Royal Mail, we wouldn't really have much sight. I think that sight only came when Post Office became independent. Just as our visibility on Royal Mail was limited, and we had no seat on the board of Royal Mail.
Prior to separation, were you personally aware that private prosecutions were being brought against sub-postmasters, their staff and Post Office employees?
I don't believe I was.
When do you think you became aware of that?
I'm not sure. I think it was certainly it'd be post our shareholder Ned hearing about it, Susanna's story. But I would guess when exactly after that, I don't know. But it wouldn't have been before that.
We've seen the minutes of the meeting in February 2014, which made reference to criminal prosecutions, criminal convictions. So presumably you were aware by that point, is that right?
I don't know. That's a fair presumption, but I can't absolutely be certain I was aware then.
Do you draw a distinction between knowing that there were convictions and knowing that there were private prosecutions?
Yes.
Again, prior to separation, were prosecutions discussed at the shareholder executive board level, to the best of your recollection?
No, I can't remember them having been discussed.
Do you recognise an inherent risk in bringing private prosecutions against its agents and staff, the Post Office being simultaneously victim, investigator and prosecutor?
For sure, I do now.
Is that something that you appreciated at the time when you became aware of the history of prosecutions?
I don't think I did. And I know I definitely, and one's memory of these things because it's a decade ago, I definitely remember taking clearly false comfort in the fact that independent courts were coming to views on the prosecution of sub-postmasters. But did I see the once I knew about the ability or the practice of the Post Office to privately prosecute, did I see the risk of false prosecutions? I don't know is the answer.
Because this was a risk which could eventuate going forwards, wasn't it? Even if prosecutions at the point you were considering it were no longer proceeding.
Yes.
Is that something you can remember discussion of at all, at any point?
No, I can't. And I was going to say, I don't, when, of course, one knows a lot more about the situation now, but when the board in 2013 effectively came to a decision to cease prosecutions, or at least look at the policy for prosecutions, I don't think I was aware of that.
With no shareholder executive, non-executive director on the board, what mechanisms existed prior to separation for ensuring that the shareholder executive was alerted to risks such as this arising from operational matters?
The reporting regime of Royal Mail to the shareholder executive and so the department, that would be the only mechanism. Well, that mechanism and individual conversations that would be taking place with officials in the department and with ministers, I think those can be the only two mechanisms.
At paragraph 88 of your statement, you address the extent to which the shareholder executive exercised oversight of the pilot or rollout of Horizon Online. You say that you did not oversee this and that you do not think that the shareholder executive would have been closely involved, as this was an operational matter that would be left to Post Office Limited and Royal Mail to implement, in line with the ALB model.
Correct.
Again, if there were operational problems which impacted risk, wouldn't that put an operational issue on the shareholder executive's radar?
Well, in theory, yes, but I'm not familiar with the Royal Mail reporting into the shareholder executive. This was absent a board member. I'm not familiar with the detail of that reporting. I would like to think that there was risk reporting, and that big operational issues would be picked up, but I can't be sure of that.
So I wonder if that might be a convenient moment for our second morning break, just for 10 minutes until past, please.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you. Hello, sir. Can you still see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Turning, please, Mr. Russell, to oversight post-separation.
Yep.
You say you became aware that the Horizon IT system had actual technical faults, later named bugs, errors and defects, at around the time you became aware of the second site interim report. In your statement, you say you cannot say exactly when that was, so I just want to try and place that in time a little, if I may. You became permanent CEO of the shareholder executive in April 2013. The interim second site report was published on the 8th of July 2013. Were you provided with the second site interim report in 2013 when it was published?
I can't remember that I was. I think, though, I'd have been provided with a summary of it.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Do you think you were ever provided with the full interim report?
I can't remember having been provided with it.
Do you recall who the summary of it came from?
Well, I don't even, there's no document that shows a summary, so I think it would probably be an oral summary. And even that I'm not certain of, but I'd have seen there had been references to it in submissions. I'm sure I'd have been aware of it.
And how soon after becoming CEO in April 2013 do you think you were made aware of the interim second site report? Within the year? Within months?
Yes, within months probably.
The interim report confirmed that 2 Horizon bugs had led to erroneous branch accounts, and it made a number of other criticisms of Post Office Limited. Do you think that this should have been flagged up to you as CEO of the shareholder executively immediately?
Well, knowing what we know now, yes. What we knew then in terms of the significance of those conclusions, I don't know that it was obvious. I mean, clearly, over the course of this inquiry, I've looked pretty carefully at these documents. And if you read paragraph 8.2 of the second site interim report, you don't come away thinking there's a profound problem here. So now we know there was, and we know that the reference to bugs was a significant point. Would the reader then have known that, and would that then have been escalated to me? I don't know. I don't think it's obvious.
Do you consider that the detail of that report should have been discussed at board level within the shareholder executive board in 2013?
Well, it could have been. I don't think it. I'm pretty sure it never was.
Do you think it should have been?
Well, on the basis of what we know now, yes. At the time, no, I don't think it was obvious at all.
2013 was also the year in which the Simon Clarke advice brought a halt to prosecutions because the Fujitsu expert who had been providing reports could no longer be relied upon. You say you were not aware of the Clarke advices until after the GLO, is that right?
That's right.
Again, is this something you should have been made aware of as CEO?
Yes.
Something that should have been discussed at shareholder executive board level?
Yes.
And where do you consider the fault lies for that not reaching you and the shareholder executive board?
Well, from what I can see, the board of Poll weren't made aware of it. So I'd certainly expect them to be aware of it and for them to inform us.
Also in 2013, there was discussion of what should and should not be included in the Royal Mail prospectus. Could we have on screen, please, POL 003-81730? Starting on page 2, please. There is an email dated the 16th of September 2013 from Georgia Preston to Alice Perkins. And the middle paragraph of this reads, I asked Martin Edwards for a briefing re your meeting with Mark Russell, but Martin just wanted to know if there is anything specific you need included in the brief, please. I was hoping to get it to you Wednesday morning when you are here, but Martin and Paula are seeing Will G Wednesday afternoon, so it might be sensible for Martin to send a few bullets after the meeting should anything come from it you need to be aware of. Are you happy? And so it appears from this there was a discussion in this email ahead of a meeting planned between Alice Perkins and you. And going back, please, to the bottom of page 1. And Alice Perkins says, hi, Georgia. My main question relates to strategy and funding. There's reference here. I also need to be on top of the industrial action, so I'll have another look at the presentation for the board deep dive. So there's some suggestion there was a deep dive into industrial action. Also the update on where we are on second site, etc., and the latest on the Royal Mail prospectus. So basically all the current hot topics. Were you aware at the time that the Royal Mail prospectus was being viewed as a hot topic?
I can't remember that, no. And actually, I can't remember any of this. I'm not particularly surprised I can't remember it because in the scheme of things, I was very involved in Royal Mail privatisation. This would not feature very high up the list.
Could we have on screen, please, UKGI 402057? Starting towards the bottom of page 3, please. The email from Alex Dunn to Jonathan Lewis, 18th of September 2013, and the subject is Prospectus, Post Office Limited comments. And we can see there in the middle paragraph, I will look through your markup in detail, but please note that the horizon point was raised specifically by one of the non-executive directors who was adamant that a reference to this must appear in the prospectus. We had drafted the revised paragraph so that it was consistent with the report and Post Office Limited's press release. Post Office Limited have reviewed this section and had no comments on it as it is now drafted, so I'm surprised that it should be of concern to the Post Office Limited team within BIS. I think this will need to stay as drafted. And then the reply to this above says, Tim, I explained the S&M to S&M the poll points and sent the attached markup. Please see the 2 emails below from S&M setting out the Post Office Limited's position. Could you look at these and let me know your thoughts? With the strength of this opposition, given it is RM's prospectus after all, there is only a limited amount of further pushing I think we can actually do. From a legal perspective, I would advise not pushing further. And then the email above this is the email is sent to Tim McInnes from the shareholder executive this time, also on the 18th of September 2013. It says, apologies, this is from Tim McInnes to Jonathan Lewis. I'm sorry, we're too high up in the emails. If we can scroll down a little, please. So that email below is from Jonathan Lewis to Tim McInnes from Shex. And then going up again, please. Thanks for this and fighting our corner. I'm not sure if I agree with any of their points. in particular certainly not around Post Office Limited signing off any wording. There are a number of emails which follow on page 1, and please, towards the bottom of page 1, we have Tim McInnes to Will Gibson. Yes, I just had Martin on the phone. Alice is properly up for a fight. I've bought some time, but let's see what Emma can set up. And then the email above from Will Gibson to Tim McInnes. And we can see their discussion again of that issue. Going up again, going further down. That email which is highlighted, Alice coming in to see Mark tomorrow, this will be raised. Can you remember being made aware that Alice Perkins was properly up for a fight over the wording of the RM prospectus?
No, I can't remember that.
Can you recall being aware that there was any issue or dispute about the wording of the Royal Mail prospectus vis-à-vis Horizon issues?
I can't remember it. This suggests I was aware, but I can't remember it.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 126 of Mr. Russell's statement? That's page 56. Here you deal with a meeting which appears to have taken place between you and Alice Perkins on the 3rd of June 2014, at which you appear to have offered some assistance in relation to Deloitte. And we can see the section of the email that is set out there. I won't read through that all now unless you need me to. And in relation to Deloitte, you deal with this at paragraph 127. And you explain here that you don't have any recollection of the meeting with Miss Perkins, but with reference to that paragraph, what were you offering in relation to Deloitte's work on Project Zebra?
Well, as I say, I don't have a memory of this, but it appears, and this would seem logical, that Alice Perkins was at the stage of hoping for a Deloitte report that was fairly positive and wanting this to be capable of being put into the public domain. And it appears Deloitte's, at that stage, weren't prepared to do that. And I could only deduce that they weren't prepared either because, as is almost certainly the case, they wanted to do further work on the system. Or what often is a reason is that in the original engagement letter, it isn't clear that a report is going to be publicised. And professional services firms like Deloitte's hate these things coming up at a later time. What was I offering? I think just to test Deloitte's as to whether they wouldn't attach their name.
You explain at paragraph 129, a little further down the page, where you make the observation that it appears that the reassurance that was given to the board by Deloitte meant that regrettably the full Project Zebra report was not scrutinised by the board or by the shareholder executive. Is that right? Is that your understanding?
Yes, yes.
And so you personally didn't see the Project Zebra report,
No.
Is that right? And you say at paragraph 203 of your statement that you did not know until the GLO that Fujitsu could insert data into branch accounts without the consent of sub-postmasters.
Correct.
or that Fujitsu may be able to delete and replace Horizon audit files containing transaction
Correct.
data. Where do you think the fault for this state of affairs lies?
Well, this should have been known by the board, I would say. Even though, my subsequent understanding is Deloitte's didn't do a detailed analysis of the system. They, in one of their reports, they clearly had raised this issue. That should have been communicated clearly to the poll board, and the poll board should have communicated it to us.
In relation to testing the option of bringing in alternative investigators, which was referred to in that email,
Yep.
that is alternative investigators to Second Sight, is that right?
Correct.
Did you tell Alice Perkins that you were interested in the option of bringing in different investigators?
Again, I can't just remember how the discussion went. My memory of Second Sight was, and when I first heard that Second Sight were involved in this review, my first question was, are these the sort of people who can do this type of work? Are they resourced correctly? I'd never heard of Second Sight. And as time went on, what I did hear, principally through my shareholder executive colleagues, was the complaint that they were struggling in terms of dealing with the various cases. Now, this may not be an accurate summary of what the problem was, but that was certainly what I was hearing. So I presume this conversation with Alice reinforced that point, that they were losing confidence in Second Sight and in their ability and capability to progress this bit of work. I think I'd have been of the view that the work was important. And the suggestion of Grant Thornton would have simply been, as I think I say, my first port of call would have been get one of the big four professional services firms more directly involved. But at the time, I was quite focused on the fact that, almost from a policy point of view, government should try to get more big four type work into the next layer down. And I think that's why I'd have suggested Grant Thornton.
Did you personally have any reason to think there was a problem with either the quality of Second Sight's work or the speed at which it was being produced, or were you reliant on what others told you?
Completely on what others told me.
I'd like to come, please, to your detailed reflections, which are set out at paragraphs 208 to 227 of your statement. Starting, please, with paragraph 208 on page 92. You say here, my involvement in the Horizon issues and how these issues were addressed during my time as CEO of the shareholder executive UKGI was not material and not nearly as material as I wish now it had been. As CEO of the shareholder executive UKGI, various levers were available to influence and, where appropriate, direct actions to be taken, either through my shareholder executive UKGI colleagues, through my relationships with the chair and CEO of the Post Office Limited, and through the shareholding department and its ministers. Put simply, do you wish now you had been more involved in Horizon issues?
Yes.
There is a lot of information you were not aware of at the time, as is evident from your statement. Do you think that the information you were aware of should have prompted you to become more involved than you were?
Well, possibly, but I think you can say that about a number of people if we'd understood the significance of what we were seeing.
Going please to paragraph 211 over the page. You deal here with some specific moments when there could have been more probing and persistence, and you list the Deloitte Project Zebra report, the final second site report, the Panorama whistleblowing allegations, and the Parker review. And these moments that you think on reflection, the shareholder executive and UKGI should have become more involved and questioned the Post Office Limited narrative further.
Yes, I do. And it is those specific instances. I go back to the interim second site report, which people still attach a lot of importance to. And I look at, as I say, paragraph 8.2, and I think after a year of work, if those are the conclusions, this is not sort of earth-shattering. So it was the final report, again, not particularly well presented, I would suggest. It was the final report that had quite a lot in it that absolutely should have been raising alarm bells.
Did you ever feel a sense from within the shareholder executive or from the department or ministers that it was too difficult to contemplate sub-postmasters being right, the consequences of that being too catastrophic?
Emphatically not. Emphatically not. I'd go so far as to say we would have relished uncovering this.
At paragraphs 212 to 2014, you discuss UKGI's failure as an organisation to appreciate the scale and the significance of the Horizon problem. And you discuss the initial focus on what you believed were major issues, such as long-term financial and commercial sustainability. And then 5 lines up from the bottom, you say this: critically, I was not aware, and to the best of my knowledge, nor were the shareholder executive UKGI board or ExCo, of the cumulative number of prosecutions and convictions until well into the GLO. I also didn't understand the significance, and again, you don't believe the board and ExCo understood the significance of post office-led prosecutions. Finally, neither you or the shareholder executive UKGI board and the ExCo were aware of the many and fundamental failings of the way in which Post Office Limited conducted its prosecutions. Going down, please, to 214. You deal with where you took comfort, but you say wrongly, I did not consider the risk of unsafe convictions as a result of failings in the Horizon system to be significant, in large part because of the repeated and categorical assurances that Post Office Limited had provided to the shareholder executive and UKGI and others about the Horizon system. If you had known the true position in respect of bugs, errors and defects in the Horizon system and the scale of the prosecutions and other action taken against sub-postmasters, their staff and post office employees, what would you have done differently?
What would I have done differently? I think lots of things differently. I think I'd have escalated it to our board, I'd have had conversations within the department, I'd have gone to see ministers. I think there's a variety of things I'd have done.
At paragraph 215 over the page, you deal again with the assurances that you were given. And at 216, you say, in spite of the above, had we had more scepticism and curiosity on our own part, out, such that we interrogated further, we might have concluded that a much fuller investigation of the system should have taken place sooner. The fact that the Post Office Limited was a relatively autonomous ALB would not have stopped us recommending a comprehensive, independent investigation if we had felt this to be necessary, albeit that this would have signalled a loss of confidence in the poll management and board. Can you help with why the shareholder executive and UKGI did not have more scepticism and curiosity at the time?
I don't think easily. I mean, this is clearly a hindsight point, and you crawl over the. I wouldn't even say they were necessarily red flags, but indications that we could have latched onto, and. I don't have any easy explanation as to why we didn't latch onto them, other than they at the time didn't appear significant, profound, and we had, we had such strong assurances from the Post Office itself and from the board, who we had actually no reason to doubt. So I don't think I can answer your question clearly as to why we didn't.
You describe at 217 the strong assertions made to ministers in submissions around the integrity of Horizon as being wrong and making for uncomfortable reading now. Can you explain what the submission should have done but did not, and why this was important?
I think they should have been clearer that, and they were clear in some, but really not all of them. They should have been clearer that this was information that we were receiving from the Post Office, and I think the way it reads is this was a kind of balanced view, which clearly it wasn't. Now, there was an absence of other detailed data points to counteract that. There was clearly a very active campaign by the sub-postmasters, but beyond that, I think we should have just been clearer as to where the information was coming from and the veracity of that information. I mean, in part, it is the reason why we were very glad when ministers engaged directly in this, because these were difficult judgments to make. So the fact Baroness Neville-Rolfe, who you'll hear from, engaged absolutely directly on some of this, I think I'm very glad that happened. Of course, we all would have liked to engage much earlier on it. But that was an indication of the difficulty in producing balanced submissions. It was, you had to hear the evidence yourself and make your own judgments.
In terms of governance, does it remain your view that the arm's length body model for Post Office Limited is not the problem? It is the issue is the execution of that model?
Absolutely, absolutely.
The inquiry may hear evidence that it would be appropriate to legislate to create a new form of government-owned entity outside the strictures of the Companies Act, conferring a discretion on ministers to intervene directly where necessary. What is your view of that suggestion?
Well, I want to see the detail. Ministers can intervene directly now, and they do. The question is, what are the triggers to do that? And the argument that we've got, particularly in an organisation like this, we've got very restricted shareholder rights is, to my mind, a red herring. It is very clear the government owns this business, and
it wouldn't, to the extent ministers or officials feel there needs to be greater operational involvement, they can do that. And they almost certainly don't need to remove boards to do that.
The inquiry may also hear evidence that it may be appropriate to give ministers or their direct representatives observer status in the board meetings of government-owned companies. Do you agree in whole or in part with that suggestion or not?
Not really. I think observer status is a very weak way of attending a board. I think you should be either a director or not. That said, I mean, an important point that hasn't really come out is this point about us putting our own directors onto boards. It really is important to understand we don't do that, or very rarely do that, on the basis that we are putting a particular skill set onto the board. We don't have that sort of capability. We do it so that the arm's length bodies understand that what ministers' priorities are, and we do it so we get information back again. But I don't see any advantage at all in weakening the director role to an observer role.
Sir, those are my questions for Mr. Russell. There are some questions from core participants, which I think we'll now need to deal with after the lunch break.
Right.
I wonder whether, looking over at the transcriber, we could come back at 10 to 2 rather than at 2 o'clock to ensure we get through those questions and our next witness today.
And what is the transcriber indicating to you, Ms. Price?
There is a nod.
Thank you very much, especially to the transcriber for facilitating the inquiry in this way. So we'll resume at 10 to 2.
Thank you, sir.